welcome everybody to this Work That Reconnects Network event. My name is Jo Delamore and I represent the Work That Reconnects Network. Thank you so much for joining us for the webinars and Conversation Cafe program, where we are providing a wide range of rich, educational, and supportive online events for our global Work That Reconnects community. Our intention is to strengthen the web of the community while reaching beyond its current edges to weave deeper connections with others who are contributing to the great turning in diverse and complementary ways. Today, we're really excited to welcome Ted Rao. We'll be exploring sociocracy for all, self-governance for the great turning. And Ted is an advocate, a trainer, and consultant for self-governance. His main focus is sociocracy. After his PhD in linguistics and work in academia, he founded Sociocracy for All, or co-founded Sociocracy for All, and spends his days consulting, teaching, and writing. And I realize I'm not 100% sure if I pronounced your last name correctly, Ted, so correct me if I was wrong. We've only been emailing. So welcome, Ted. We'll turn it over to you to just say a quick hello before we get started.
Yeah, hello. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you.
Wonderful. Great. So today we're going to be leaning into sociocracy as a method for social change within the Great Turning. A very practical, how are we moving together into the Great Turning? So we're looking at it as an essential tool for engaging in the Great Turning because governance is absolutely part of our lives. And I think we can all agree that there are a lot of issues with the way that governance is done in business as usual environments, business as usual forms of governance that are being used in our national governments, in our businesses, and our nonprofit organizations are riddled with issues. But these business as usual examples aren't the only ways that governance can work. So as we're working to create and support life-sustaining societies, we need to get creative in learning and becoming skillful in functional, egalitarian, co-liberatory methods for working together and making decisions together. So while we do this, we're unlearning oppressive patterns and forms of governance while learning new or remembering more ancient ways of becoming skillful at co-liberatory, life-sustaining forms of governance. And this is where sociocracy can help us out. So we're going to start by asking you, Ted, if you can tell us a little bit more about what sociocracy is. And we've got a basic kind of framework to start with that we'll pop in the chat, that the Sociocracy for All website describes sociocracy as a method of dynamic self-governance, which helps groups of people organize in a decentralized way and make decisions with equity, efficiency, empowerment, trust, and transparency. So can you tell us a little bit more about that and how it works?
Sure. So I want to actually start with what governance is, because most people don't really spend their days thinking about governance. You know, I was one of them for a long time. I did not in my dreams think that I would be such a thing as a governance trainer. That would have sounded very boring. And now I see it as one of the most exciting things there are. So what is governance? It's basically everything that we need when we are more than one person and we try to do something together, right? It's how do we decide? Who decides what? How do we have meetings? For example, how do we decide what we even talk about, right? Somehow that gets decided in our meetings. How do we talk? Like who gets to talk, how long, and on what? So overall, what sociocracy is trying to do is trying to provide tools and processes so that that happens in the most egalitarian and yet effective way possible. So it's a system that was put together in the late 70s, so around the time I was born, in the Netherlands, but based on a lot of other things as well, because nothing is ever brand new, right? Many of the things are very old. And it's really designed to create better answers than all this business as usual, as it was just mentioned. So the first one on how do we decide is decision making by consent. So a decision only moves forward when there's no objection. That's the super short version of it. So everybody kind of needs to at least say, yeah, this is good enough. We can do this. So nobody can just kind of push their agenda against resistance. The second one is who decides what. And ideally, things get decided in small groups where people know each other and trust each other. So it's very relational in that way. And those are real decision makers. So there's not some boss that can then walk in last minute and change everything. The people who do stuff actually decide. And then there's a bunch of things, like one thing that I like to mention is rounds and how we have meetings. A kind of a flagship thing is just circle practice, that we know from other places too, of just the practice of talking one by one. It's super simple, ridiculously easy, and yet it really changes the culture, right, into a way of like more listening and more consideration of more voices in the room and so on. So that is something that is pretty much standard in sociocratic ways of doing things.
Great. Beautiful. So self-governance is a really key piece of this. Why is it so important? You kind of touched on it there as far as the CEO can't walk in and change it, but how does this self-governance, what's the significance of it in the wider context?
Yeah, one of the things is that, so let me talk about where the word comes from, because sometimes people don't like it so much, and it carries really the essence of that. So sociocracy means those who associate together, govern together. So in a simplified version, that's basically those who do stuff together, decide together.
Mhm.
So it's not somebody else, it's the people themselves, right? Like, for example, if we have, like, I live in an intentional community that is running sociocratically. I am, for example, not involved in the garden circle, garden committee. They decide everything about the garden. They are the people who do stuff. They are the people who decide, and I shouldn't walk in there, tell them what to do. So it's that really self-managing ourselves, self-organizing, that is really one of the key principles. And to me, that's important, because to me, that's in these forms of business as usual governance methods, we've basically given away the power into other places, right? And this is about reclaiming governance. So for me, it even starts just with the words, like, do we have kind of a, ooh, governance, that sounds boring kind of reaction? Or we say, oh, governance, that's how we decide what we want to do, like that's what I would like to reinterpret, kind of reclaiming governance as something for the people and by the people, with the people.
Mm-hmm. Right. In actuality, not just in the logo, in the motto.
Exactly, yes, for
Yeah.
real.
Yeah. Beautiful. And yeah, that direct connection with the means of the work and the outcome of the work and the input gives the people who are doing the work particular insight into what needs to be decided. So that's very important. When somebody disjointed like a CEO or some higher up in a power over structure um, is making decisions, they often don't have that direct knowledge, that direct connection with what's going on. Yeah.
And that gets shown over and over, right? That the people, like, the further you are away in some sort of management hierarchy, the less you know what's actually happening. And so it just really doesn't fit together how we do things, and how it would just make much more sense.
Absolutely. So can you tell us a little bit about Sociocracy for All, the organization, why it formed, what it does, what it offers?
Yes. So Sociocracy for All was, I think we started in 2016, 2015. I never know these things. I should have looked it up. But it's like we started, and somehow, we didn't really ever intend for it to grow into the big thing that it is right now, although Sociocracy for All kind of sounds like a grandiose vision. But where we were coming from was that Sociocracy at that point was already a few decades old, but not really, like, I remember when I learned about it, I was like, wait, why doesn't everybody know about this? Like, that is something that everybody should just have access to. And I don't mean because everybody should do it. People should decide themselves what they do. but they should at least know that it exists, right? If we're not told these things, then we don't even have the choice. So what we wanted with the for all was get it out there so people can choose, and get it out there as affordably and as easily and as accessibly as possible.
Mhm.
So that's what we did. We started with videos and articles, we wrote books, we do training, and also we connect all the people who are really excited and enthusiastic about sociocracy so they can meet each other. Like, for example, we organize by language. We have a big department that is doing sociocracy in Spanish and in French and in German and whatnot. And we also organize by sector. So we have people who are into sociocracy and permaculture, that connection, sociocracy nonprofit, sociocracy at work, so that people can find each other. And just overall, we see ourselves as kind of a movement support organization, right? We are not the movement, but there is a movement, and we help it by helping people find each other and injecting kind of these affordable resources. That's the core of it. And the way we keep afloat is by implementation help, consulting, training, donations, grants, those things.
Mhm. Great. Thank you. Thank you for developing this resource that's supportive and helpful. It definitely has been helpful for us as we, in the work that Reconnects Network, try to define what we're doing and try to understand why we're doing what we're doing. We've tapped into the resources on your website for some language to help explain to ourselves what we're doing and to understand it. So now, as we've said here, we know that the way that we govern and the way that we relate with each other is a critical aspect of human society, just being human. Whenever, like you said, whenever there's more than one person, we have to relate to each other, make decisions and move forward together. But we've got to learn how to do it differently, obviously, if we want to create life-sustaining societies, because the way that we make the decisions is actually really has a huge impact on the way that society functions and the impact that we have around us. So I've heard and I've seen that sociocracy can sometimes be simply used as a tool for like productivity and efficiency. And sometimes people are using it really in that focus. But beyond that, as a culture shifting tool for co-liberation, how do you see sociocracy serving our collective movement towards well-being for all?
Such a big question, isn't it? So, first I want to comment on that productivity and efficiency thing, because I think, yeah, what you're saying is, completely with you, that sometimes it's that. Like, I remember I was talking to a CEO and owner of a nanotechnology business. And he was somehow in love with sociocracy, which I honestly had a little bit like, wait, where's this coming from? Kind of a reaction to, because I don't know, it just didn't seem, something seemed off about it, how he was talking about it. So I asked him, like, I guess what I asked him was, what do you want to learn in this?
Mhm.
And he said, oh, learn? No, I just want people to work more efficiently, right? I was like, whew. Somehow I wasn't as inspired anymore. And actually also that shared project never happened. So all to acknowledge, yes, that exists. And yet there's something I want to say about that. And of course, that's kind of a lot of, there's quite some discussion about that I have with colleagues. And that's the big question of, if people, for example, talk in rounds or make decisions together, let's say they don't just go through the motion, right? Or like lipstick on a pig, like,
Mhm.
but they actually do it. That still might be introduced as a way to just increase productivity, but it would still change something, right? Because how long can you be asking everybody around the room till that somehow does something to your culture? So there's kind of this open question for us that I have a really hard time answering, of like, is that a bad starting point or is it a starting point? So I'm undecided on that. I just wanted to say that. But on the bigger question of, well, how does it support to call it or provide whatever? No, provide is not the right word. What would I want to say? Contribute to collaboration. There are three ways that I see. The first one is Um, just because most decentralized systems are more flexible and kind of have a better way of dealing with complexity. So that is a big piece, right? Because our world is becoming more and more complex.
Mhm.
All the systems are interconnected. So what governance system that is not just top down, the boss decides no matter what he or she knows, um, what, yeah, having more places where people can make decisions and can and respond and adapt
Mhm.
will make for a less fragile organization. That's one piece.
Mhm.
The other one is um, that it changes individual mindsets, kind of as I already alluded to. And actually, I noticed that myself. Um, I learned so much just about how to be a decent human being. There's this super nice quote that a colleague, Edwin John, said. Like, he said, basically what sociocracy does is it puts you into groups, right? And then you're like pebbles in the stream. You kind of smoothen each other out. And I absolutely love that image because that's what it feels like, right? Like, you just put a 5 or 6 people together, that will do something. Um, so especially then with systems like rounds and all of that, now people start to notice how there are other people that have good ideas,
Mhm.
how they show up in relationship to that. So that's a big piece. Hold on, what was my third thing? All right, the other one is that we can learn how to take responsibility together. So
Mhm.
because there's so much of the trouble that we're in, from my point of view, has to do with just responsibility not being held properly, like in a healthy way, and then that leaks out into all the other ways in which we then try to avoid doing that. So what sociocracy does, it provides us kind of that container to hold responsibility and decision making power together, and that way we can learn how to really deal with it together as equals. And that's really, there are not many systems that provide that on that collective level, because there's often the individual level, right, of like individual self work and personal transformation, but this is really about groups. This is about how do groups interact. So that's a whole different category of things, actually. And with that, a huge leverage point, right? A humongous leverage point, because nothing and hardly anything can be done alone, really. So that's one thing that's needed.
Yeah.
Let me add one thing, and that is, just because I don't want to forget it, and it's really important to me. So sociocracy is a governance system, right? So as such, it does, I think, impact how people think. Like, for example, when I learned Browns, I realized that I was one of the people, prior to my realization, that in meetings would, talk more than others. And it was through rounds and just sitting with that I noticed that was not necessary. Um, so it changed me. But what it can do is it can't undo, like, for example, internalized bias. It can't, create, at least not like that, less unequal societies. Like, it's just, there's, economic stuff, like there's so many other systems that are kind of more on the individual personal side or on the more societal side that we in our organizations don't really necessarily have as much leverage over. So I just sometimes get a little worried when people kind of think that sociocracy is just going to fix everything, organizations and individuals and society as a whole. Like, that's putting a lot on just a governance system. I think it needs to be used with other systems together so that it can um yeah, so they can mutually reinforce each other. But you can't just say, oh, let's use sociocracy that's going to fix everything and also, racism at the same time, because it won't.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
now that said.
Absolutely. But like you did say, governance and using a form of governance like this will shift the culture, will shift the way that we think about things. So in a way, it is a tool that can, it's not like it's going to be the fix for all, but I feel like it actually is a very practical way of reorienting ourselves with each other. Because and I've been in organizations and systems where we weren't using sociocracy per se. I've been in councils and boards where we use Robert's rules, which is just, you know, very kind of business as usual, democratic way of making decisions. But in some of those groups, we the culture was shifting us towards let's listen to everybody. When we come in, so we usually wouldn't make a vote until everybody had been heard. So there was some cultural kind of already woven in collectivism. But when you bring sociocracy, and that's the form and the structure, it lends you towards that. It says it points you in that direction, so it can actually be the thing that's helping shift the culture. And I really loved the decentralized piece that you were talking about. It, to me, and in my mind and how I work with the work that Reconnects Network, it brings up mycelial connections, that like that web, that decentralized, like there's intelligence throughout the whole system, and all of the individuals and all of the relationships that are present in the system contain intelligence and an agency. So that shared responsibility that you were talking about too is just like, instead of everybody waiting, holding back and waiting for somebody with the power to make the decision, to take responsibility for the thing, we say, okay, we're here together for a shared purpose. And so we're holding this together, the responsibility, and any of us who are able and have the skills or the connection to the thing that needs to be done can lean into it. And yeah.
Can I just bring an example for that, just so that people have something to kind of to put their hat on?
Yeah.
So I was talking to a head of school in the US, and she, this was a private school, kind of alternative school, and she was just kind of in the beginning of implementing sociocracy when the pandemic hit.
Mm.
And she told me, oh my gosh, if I had not distributed authority into circles before the pandemic, it would have broken my back. Because, she would have needed to figure out everything, because everybody would have looked at her, and she would have been incredibly overwhelmed, and that would have created a bottleneck, and all the things that followed from that. But instead, what happened was power was already distributed, and all the different places just made the adjustments themselves because they were empowered to do so. And she was like, oh, that was easy. The whole school just kind of adapted itself. Fantastic. So that's an example of that resilience that comes from decentralization, like a network. So that's a big one.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great example. And a great thing for that school to have happened just in the right amount of time. So that leads kind of into the next question, like, how does it work kind of on the ground, and like how can the people who are listening to us now in our work that reconnects community around the world use sociocracy in the organizations that they work in, or in their communities, in the movements that they contribute to?
Yeah. Let me preface something here. And I, because it's not so easy to say. So, what's really important for me to see is that they're kind of different, how like systems thinking, any kind of system, any kind of level will have its own emergent properties. So, like cells follow their own rules, and organs follow different rules, and organisms follow other rules. It's the same thing with organizations. I think we just somehow don't see it yet. And I hope that we're like about to launch into an age where that is just obvious to people. So, and how that translates is an individual is very different from a group, and a group of groups, organizations, are very different from groups. They each have their special things about them. So one key, I want to even call it a mistake, or like a flawed thinking that people use around governance, is they say, oh, it's the 10 of us, we're all good human beings, therefore we will be a good group. And that is, I'm sorry, not true. That's even dangerous to think. And I will tell you why it's dangerous. Because let's say the 10 people don't have a proper decision-making method. Somebody eventually gets upset because it's just a matter of time. Now, if we think that good people make good groups and our group process fails, does it mean we're not good people? Does it mean it's somebody's fault?
Mhm.
Then we start blaming each other or thinking, oh my God, we're not good enough. Maybe we're not passionate enough. Maybe we're not this or that enough. No, you just used the individual processes and thought they would scale into groups, which they don't.
Mhm. Mhm.
So what that seems to be kind of the message that I keep coming back to, of just don't get fooled by governance.
Mhm.
And another thing about that is just, I so dream of a world where that just gets taught in schools, because right now there's absolutely nothing about that, right? We write like 25 essays, but we don't learn how to make a group decision. And I think that's really something that is absolutely needing to change. So what, so now going to your question, I
Mhm.
guess what I would want is for people to take governance seriously, kind of as a thing, right? Just it's another one of the things that we need to learn, and
Mhm.
that we don't just we're not just born with knowing how to read and write. We're not just born knowing how to write an essay. We're not just born knowing how to make a group decision.
Mhm.
So it's really about skills and about very nuts and bolts kind of stuff, right? I mean, it's funny sometimes when I teach, I prepare things and I think like, oh my God, that's so nuts and bolts. Nobody's going to find that interesting. Like, for example, like what's a good way of writing notes? Then like, that's really a boring thing to teach. But then people are like, no, that is exactly what we need. We need a good way of writing notes. How do I organize my notes document? How do I, like, what are the steps of decision making?
Mhm.
And so, for example, in let's look at decision making. There's a very, very simple way of making decisions that I really enjoy. And that's first step. Ask everybody whether it's clear to them. Like, what is the proposal? What's the issue? Is it all clear to you? Do you understand it? And only when everybody says, yep, I get it now, then go to the next step and say, okay, what's your reaction? What comes up for you?
Mhm.
And only when everybody has spoken, go to, okay, do you think we should do it? Because
Mhm.
all three are very different questions and they need to be asked in that order. Because
Mhm.
otherwise we're going to have opinions on something we didn't understand or we misunderstood, right? Or we decide and then we talk more, which makes no sense because then it's time to do stuff. So this is the order, and one can just use that really from my point of view. So learning things like decision making by consent, which I just said,
Mhm.
learning things like rounds, and just kind of being informed about how governance works. That's a very concrete thing one can do. And yeah, I think the two things that typically people start with are the two things that I quoted: consent decision making and rounds. And
Mhm.
then there's more where that came from when you have that. But that's something that you can just turn around and do now.
Mhm. So I want to just go to that example that you said there about the consent decision making. I feel like I've had that experience countless times in groups where we are going out of order. We're not really mindful of that specific order. And even if it's articulated, I feel like I notice people have a very strong tendency to want to like jump in the mud. They just really want to like share opinions about things that they're not fully informed about, or kind of get like really in there. And there's a lot of um we have a lot of personality stuff, we have a lot of projection, we have trauma that we're bringing into the groups, we have all sorts of things as humans that we're bringing into our group spaces. So having that articulated really clearly and knowing intentionally, okay, we're going to go into this in these three steps, so that when opinions start coming in at the first step, you can say, oh, no, no, we're going to wait on that. We're just clarifying right now. It's just clarification round. And I feel like the groups need to practice that a while to get good at it, like to understand, oh, that's what we're doing, and to trust we're going to get to that stage where I can share my opinions. I don't have to say it all in this first round. I know we've done this, 3 or 4 times now. Oh, I get it. We're going to say clarifying round. What was it? Questions, or addition.
Consent, yes.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think that's just really, really good place to start. If you're working with any groups, whether you're living in community or in a movement space, bringing in that simple practice is great. Yeah.
And then the next thing is, just because I realized I didn't say it and I wish I had, but let's just add it. What does it mean to consent?
Mhm.
Right? Because typically in groups, there are kind of two things that happen. One is kind of more power over, and one is a little bit of a power under way. So the power over way is, which I let me actually make it a story because I was baffled back then. So this was somebody who was actually happened to teach group decision making, but what she was doing was she asked kind of in a room of 30 people, like, oh, let's do this and this and this and that. And I was thinking, well, she was probably going to ask whether that's okay. So, right, I was ready to say that I actually wasn't because of a very particular, specific thing, kind of, and that had an easy fix too. But that's not what happened. What happened was she kind of looked into the room and said, okay, looks like we're all on board. Let's do it. It's like, wait, what? You're not asking? Like, you're actually not going to ask? You just is, wow. Like I was really like astonished that we're not being asked. I didn't even know retrospectively when or where I was supposed to say that it wasn't okay. So that was interesting.
Mhm.
But so that's kind of a power over way, right? Because she just called it.
Mhm.
And that happens all the time. And I mean, if people, if you ask them how they make decisions, they typically say, oh, we just talk till we've decided. Well, I'm like, well, what does that mean? It means the most powerful person just said that they support that and nobody else spoke up anymore. Like, what does it actually mean when you say that? And then on the other hand, there's kind of a power under way, right? If people do like power under, quoting somebody who wrote a book with that title, Power Under. So basically, it's when people don't take responsibility or power that they have, right? For
Mhm.
example, oh, that sounds good. I'm not so sure. How about you just decide that yourself? Or like decide it without me? I'm like, well, is there a problem that you see that you're not sharing with us?
Right.
What's the reason of why you're not willing to be co-responsible here, So there are all those different ways. Or how about we just vote? So then I can vote against it and say that I was against it, but then we're going to do it anyway because I don't actually want to contribute. Like there's all this messy kind of toxic stuff that people do, right?
Yeah.
And so what consent means is it doesn't have to be a preference, but is there a reason against it? And if so, please say it. And if not, let's just do it. So it doesn't have to be your first choice. It just means, do you think, and kind of the technical definition is, do you think there's any reason of why this thing that we're proposing and talking about right now harms what we said we would do?
Right.
If not, try it. And that, because there's so many groups that just talk on and on and on and on because there's someone not willing to kind of put their cards on the table. And that's its own way of power under it because it means you're not doing anything. You're not cashing in the power that you have, basically.
Mhm.
So yeah, consent that we interpret our yes or no not against our own preferences but against the collective aim. And
Mhm.
that's a total game changer because it's not about me if I'm in the group, it's
Right.
about what do I think serves the group.
Right. Yeah. Two very big pieces that you just shared there that I see happening all the time. One being that there's not an effective pause and an effective, meaningful check for consent. A lot of the times it's like, oh, thumbs up, but like, really, are there any objections to this? And then really giving not only a moment to pause, but like a safe space, like an authentically safe space. It is okay to express your objections. We want to hear the objections. Um, that's very, very important. And then the other one of, oh goodness, I lost it.
Maybe it was about the collectiveness of the aim, that it's not about.
Yes, yes. Right. Yeah. So, you know, we're trained in our highly individualistic society to always be thinking about our preferences. And when we're working in groups, it's very important to be focused on the shared purpose. So if you're in a nonprofit organization, you have a mission. If you're on a committee, you have a purpose and a scope for that committee. If you are in a movement, you have, the core principles of that movement. And so whether you think it should be purple or blue doesn't really matter. It's like, is this going to further the mission or is it going to harm the mission? And that's where you have to take your personal responsibility to speak up. If you say, actually, if we move forward in this way, it's going to set us back. or it's going to cause some harm. And so that's where everybody needs to have their eyes and ears really open to be paying attention. Like, are we moving in a direction that is in alignment with our shared purpose? Yeah.
And I love the way you describe it also with all eyes and ears open and all of it, because in a way, we're kind of decentralizing the check for is this okay into all the individual minds, right? Like for a second, like put yourself into this whole thing, you know, into this whole space, proposal, what you project will happen, what all the needs are around us. Do you see any kind of anything that is not going to work, right? Is there anything like, oh, hold on, because if we look at it that way, it's also not that I am against your thing, right? It's just like, wait, there are different things happening here, right? We're just checking for alignment. That's how I think about it. Just checking for alignment. Does it work out? Oh, yeah, I think so. So now if somebody says no, actually, of course, that's a good thing because they found something in which we would have should have shot ourselves in the foot, right? So now they say, thank you for finding that. What is it?
Mm-hmm.
Can be excited about creating alignment. So it completely changes what a yes means, what a no means. It just changes all of those different things. I just absolutely love that. And I use it like, for example, you know, like consent as a mindset, just I use it everywhere, like in talking to my kids, you know. There's actually a little story that I want to tell about that just because it gets us a little bit out of the abstract and it's a sweet story. It's fairly recent. So I wanted to go to this one day event with like grown-ups basically. And but I was with my kids and my 13-year-old was like, oh, you know, we're gonna go on a farm with grown-ups. Like, what could possibly be more boring than that? And I had to admit there was a good chance it might be boring because grown-ups might be sitting in the grass talking, right? And then what she's gonna do? What is she gonna do?
Mm-hmm.
But I was like, there's also a good chance she's just gonna fall in love with the place, you know, and maybe even play with a little brother, which is unlikely, but could happen. Now, what I did was then I kind of used my facilitator skills, you know, and there's kind of different ways of how you can work with an objection. Basically, what she did was object, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's a strategy that I really love of kind of putting like terms on something, like when do we evaluate and how do we evaluate it? And what I did was I said, okay, Jules, listen, we're gonna go there at 10:30. For 1.5 hours, I want you to just be there. And at noon, I promise I will ask you. If it's very boring for you, if you really say, I absolutely want to leave, I'm going to drive you home real quick and I'll go back and you can just stay home alone, which is fine. And she knew I was real about it, right? So I didn't just say that to kind of, you know, smoothen out the waves. So then she was like, okay, fine, you know, 1.5 hours of being bored, which she was sure she was up for, you know, like not up for, but that was what
Guaranteed.
was, yes, that was in her future. So like, fine, 1.5 hours. Okay, you know, insert 13-year-old attitude here. And then just I went, I mean, I was extremely lucky. I was very lucky because it turns out that somebody had brought along her best friend from school. They didn't know. So they showed up, you know, at noon. I still did it, you know. I still said, so Jules, I promised I would ask at noon. Yeah, now I want to stay. Okay, great, you know. So I'm telling that story because it shows, first of all, it, you know, it matters that things work for people. Like I wouldn't want to be there for 7 hours with a child that doesn't stop rolling her eyes, and it would have been unfair, right? And the other one is just how easy it is to integrate a no when you know how to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Really not that hard. So I use it just as a mindset all the time. I highly recommend getting good at hearing a no.
Absolutely. Oh, I definitely concur. I actually use that in my work with parents all the time. And I find it highly important to make sure that everybody's needs are being met. Like everything's gonna go so much better in a family situation if everybody's needs are being met. And if the objections get voiced, you can respond to them. You can say, oh, okay. Oh, we might need to make an adjustment here so that you're gonna be okay, I'm gonna be okay, and we're all gonna move forward together. It's very similar to in an organization. You know, where if people feel unheard and if they feel that it's not safe to voice their objection or their opinions, or if they do voice them and they get overlooked or they get, you know, kind of bulldozed, then you're going to wind up with a fractured organization, and people are not going to then be taking responsibility, feeling that sense of shared empowerment. And there's going to be all sorts of conflict and, all sorts of things that are going to take away from your shared work and your well-being. So as we're doing this work, we're not just trying to get stuff done. We're also trying to live life better, in a deeper, more beautiful, more connected way. So we want ourselves and our coworkers and our, fellow movement activists and everybody, we want everybody to be well, and we want our work to be moving towards collective wellness. I love that also how this can be shifting us really much more into co-liberation, and it takes some practice and some unlearning and some relearning and some reconditioning and a lot of trust building to be shifting the ingrained patterns that are in us and in our groups because of the way that we've been conditioned by society. So that kind of shifts us into this next piece here to explore that unlearning and relearning, because every group is made up of individuals that have been raised and conditioned and trained in the dominant society, or in society. Every person has been trained and conditioned in a society. Most of our groups are heavily full of people who have been trained by the business as usual dominant power over paradigm society. So we're bringing in those ingrained habits, those patterns, those ideas, and as we're creating a new way of being together, we have to unlearn those. So I'm curious, what are some of those habits and patterns that you've noticed that need to be identified and unlearned when new groups come together, or when we're starting to try to apply this new way of governance?
Yeah, the main thing for me is really, and we can unpack that now a little more, is what I would summarize as power over and power under behavior, because they're just everywhere. I mean, it's everywhere. So let me say a little about what I mean by that. So power over, right, as I said earlier, deciding for others, kind of being in other people's business, basically, right? So if we're in a group and one person decides, now that person decided for everybody else's sphere, basically. Power under, giving away our own power, or pretending we're not responsible, or playing the victim card, for example. And the way I see it now is that in a group, it's really hard to be in that middle of power with, right? Because it's so easy to tip into each of this, like any of the sides, power over, power under. So how do you just really hold on while being open to listening? And what is needed for that, for me, are basically agreements, right? And kind of having these explicit processes. That's why I'm so big on nuts and bolts, actually, because I see that helps people provide enough structure so we don't have to do the power over, power under. Because, so in a way, I'm kind of answering two questions here. One is, what are the behaviors that are the ingrained patterns, but also what are the conditions that surface those, right? And for me, it's a lack of clarity and lack of governance that then surfaces those behaviors. So in order to undo those, we have to up our level of governance, right, in a healthy way. And then people have to kind of monitor, or like whatever, do the inner work to kind of snap out of those behaviors more often, not in absolute terms at all, because we will always fall back on those. So here's what I mean. Here's a very, very concrete example, again, from a company where the former leader or owner, CEO, whatever, he wanted to distribute power. And he also did that, but it never fully got distributed. Like, people were doing stuff, but they never talked about, for example, financial decisions, hiring, firing, and so on. That was kind of just like in the vague, strategic decisions and all of that. And so then people from the company came to me to complain about their boss, how that boss sometimes makes these unilateral decisions, you know, like, and they, so I listened to that for a while and I realized, wow, the boss doesn't have, or former boss or whatever he's called now, doesn't have any other chance. Because if it's not held somewhere co-responsibly, what else is he going to do, right? You have to hire on fire. You have to eventually, like, budgeting needs to be done. So if you don't provide a process for it, of course he's going to go into power over behavior, because everybody else is also in, well, I'm not responsible and he shouldn't play power over behavior. And now we're all stuck, right? Now he's not allowed to say what we should do and we're not going to say it, and there's no process to do it. So now what?
Mhm.
That to
Mhm.
me kind of shows the mess that we're in, right? The mess that we're in, if like, well, of course it's easy to point fingers of, you know, the boss shouldn't have done these unilateral decisions and all this power over crap. But he's of course gonna tell himself, I'm pretty sure, I've never talked to him, but I'm very certain that he's gonna tell himself, well, somebody's got to do it. They're not
Have to be
doing it.
done, right?
It needs to be done, you know. And then that people say these phrases, and I'm really kind of sensitive to those phrases of things people say, like, well, sometimes you just have to dot dot dot. Well,
Mhm.
somebody will have to dot dot dot. Well, nobody is ever dot dot dot. Like all of those things that to me, when I listen to it, I like, ooh, there's not enough governance here.
Mhm. Mhm.
Because if you have agreements about that, then you can make those decisions. If not, you're gonna whine. That's basically what it is. Anyway,
Yeah.
so back to your questions of what are those ingrained habits. I think
Wait.
it's people who don't see governance and then go into those different behaviors because we don't leave them any other chance. It's not their fault.
Right. Okay. I want to circle back to that, but this is a piece that I kind of forgot to weave in earlier, the structure. So, besides just decision making, we talked a lot about consent decision making. Sociocracy isn't just how do you make decisions, but it's also like the shape of the relationships and the structure and who's doing what, where, and why, and how do those people relate to these people. So that's one of the things I love about sociocracy is, or sometimes circle governance can be used, right, to describe it. So this, like, the circles of circles and the relationships of the circles and who's doing what and where, and it's the places where there's not a circle caring for, and I always think of, the circles are taking care, they're caring for, they're tending to different areas of things that need to be cared for. So if there's something that needs to be done or needs to be cared for, and there's no circle designated for it, or there hasn't been a decision made about, like, well, when we cross that bridge, who's going to take care of that? Then boom, old patterns step in, or that power over thing, or somebody just goes for it. And there's all sorts of different kinds of decisions that get made unconsciously, like by default or by influence. And um we don't, and sometimes, if that's what's been decided, is like, okay, this topic is in the scope of this circle, and within that circle there's somebody who's just taking care of it because it needs to get done, and it's within their zone to take care of. Okay. But if nobody's been kind of authorized to do that by the group, then we won't run into some tricky old paradigm issues. So I don't know if you want to say a little bit more about the structure and shape.
Yeah, I'm happy to. I mean, in a way, like just bouncing off of what you just said, the way kind of the way it looks in my head is that it's basically the same behavior, just one level up. So earlier I said, individuals don't work like groups, and also
Mhm.
groups don't work like groups of groups. So if there's kind of stuff that falls through the cracks and nobody is responsible in a team, then decision making is in trouble. If teams are not responsible for something that falls through the cracks on an organizational level, the same thing happens, as you just said, right? Then somebody's going to step in and so on, like the CEO. Now, let's see. So structure, how does it structure work? So the idea is that it's basically following what's called a natural hierarchy. And that doesn't mean that there's bosses and so on, but all that it means is everything is part of something. That's
Mhm.
really what it is, right? Just like the tree has a branch, has leaves and so on. So just like that, Twitter, no, let's not use Twitter. Let's use
So let's
something.
not.
Let's use Instagram a little
Sure.
bit, maybe. Instagram is actually not, never mind. But anyway, so Instagram is part of social media, is part of communications,
Mhm.
right? So everything kind of lives somewhere. Now, or let's use my community. Conflict resolution is part of kind of community life, is part of the whole community. Garden is part of landscaping or whatever. So everything kind of fits into something. So there's nesting happening, and we try to reflect that in the circle structure, in the organizational structure. So, for example, in my community, so this is 70 people living in 32 houses. There are 4 main circles. One is for gardens and landscaping, one is for the community building, one is for everything interpersonal, and I'm forgetting one, community building. Oh, buildings and grounds. So houses, roofs, plowing. Okay, so now how it works is those 4 circles self-responsibly do what they've been given, right? What we call a domain. And some of them also form subcircles, like conflict resolution, can council, we call it, is kind of a subcircle of community life, and so on. Kitchen is a subcircle of common house. So all of these basically now have teams that are doing self-responsible work. For example, kitchen can decide kitchen things without asking common house, like community building circle. That's important because otherwise we still have bosses somewhere, right? So we really want to decentralize. Remember the school example of everybody just does their own thing.
Mhm.
And since we know what box we're playing in, it's all good. We're not ideally stepping on each other's toes. And we make good decisions because it's the people who work in the kitchen that are going to make decisions about the kitchen, not someone else. So that's how it all works. There's one other thing, just for completeness, that's one of the core principles, and that's called linking. So if we have, let's say, kitchen circle, ideally we have 2 people that also attend the community building circle. So that community building knows what happens in kitchen, and kitchen knows what happens in community building, right?
Right.
So now we have this full transparency, information flows. It kind of creates this mesh, or like this web of
Yeah.
independent circles that are each doing their own thing. And that's a brilliant thing. And then, sorry, one more thing. Now at the kind of most, kind of at the hub in the middle, okay, if you imagine kind of nested fractals, there is a middle, right? And that middle, which is often called the general circle, now has 2 people from all the main circles.
Mhm.
And they ideally make no decisions, or very few decisions. Ideally, they just make sure everything has a place. And if we find something that doesn't have a place where it can be decided,
Mhm.
that's when we can self-repair and now put it somewhere. So
Mhm.
they basically decide who decides what.
Mhm.
And now we have a self-repairing system.
Yeah. Beautiful. Beautiful. I love that because it isn't that everybody's just doing their own thing. It's everybody is doing what they are directly connected to, and they're communicating about it with each other. So that communication makes the whole thing work really well, that double linking. And this kind of semi-autonomous. So you're autonomous within the scope that we've already previously agreed on, right? So
Right.
you're totally autonomous within that scope, and in relationship with the other circles that are autonomous within their scopes and in communication. Yeah, love that. So, okay, so just going kind of circling back to this whole unlearning ingrained patterns. I would think, or I know I see in groups that I'm in that we have things that we've brought from our families. We have things that we've been conditioned in, through our personality. There's obviously racism and sexism and classism very strongly at play in all of our social situations. So when we're coming into a group and saying, okay, we're going to go in rounds, everybody's voice matters, we're going to make a decision together. Those I feel like are great structures and can help us move in a direction, but they're not the instant answer, because we also are going to have some people who are very forceful, don't listen very well. We're going to have other people who really hang back for different reasons. We're going to have people who are suspicious of the organization or or organization in general, for all different kinds of reasons. So what are some of those like stickiest areas that you notice that it may take individuals and groups a little while to unlearn, and anything that you kind of can share with us about that?
Yeah, I'm just going to use the same individual group kind of thing again, because that's very much on my mind these days. It's a very useful lens. So really, in a way, governance requires kind of working with people who have their interface kind of clear, right? Who kind of are, know what they want, what they don't want, and so on. Like so that they kind of have their own boundaries clear. Groups are very much in trouble when people don't. And there's only so little one can do in a group with somebody who's not kind of willing to share their boundaries or whatever. So now you've mentioned, right, all the isms and trauma. Uh,
Mhm.
Sometimes it's simply not in the cards for people to be, on kind of on what I would call kind of, I don't know, clean is not the right, I don't know, kind of in that constructive kind of mode.
Mhm.
So any system needs to also be able to buffer that a little bit, but that's why we're not alone, right? So there would be other people. But what I find that people really struggle with then is kind of where am I and where's the group? Like having that clear of having kind of the both andness clear of there's me and my needs and
Mhm.
there's the group's needs.
Mhm.
So I'm going to give you an example because it shows in a zillion ways. And here's a very typical way in which it shows. Let's say you do a brainstorm together, right?
Mhm.
Brainstorm means everybody throws out ideas, right? And typically people, there's always a little bit of ego involved, right? I mean, that's true for all of us, I assume. It's certainly
Mhm.
true for me, right? You propose something, you're like, oh my God, yes, that, let's do that.
Mhm.
But now you have 8 people in the room that fall in love with their ideas. But we're only one group, we can probably only do maybe 2 or 3 of them,
Mhm.
right? And that's that crunch zone of where we now like say like, okay, now we have a list of 12 ideas, which one are we going to do? And that is the moment where basically we need to say, okay, just now I spoke as an individual, and now I have to basically say like, okay, and now let's look at it through the lens of what is good for the group right now. What does the group need right now? And not one at the expense of the other, right? It's not that we say, oh, I don't care who you are as an individual, just function for the group. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying, but how can we hold them both, right? And that's so hard. It's
Mhm.
incredibly hard. And then again, the same thing on the next level, right? How can I kind of think about my team, but also say, yeah, but where's the organization at right now? And then even beyond that, right? This is what our organization needs, but what does the movement need right now? What does society need right now? I mean, we're all these things at once, right? And that's just incredibly hard. So where am I going with all this? I guess that's what I notice on a kind of on a high level, that people often have no sense of that. And why would they? Typically you're not asked to do any of that. Typically you're just asked for your opinion or not. It's like,
Mhm.
so there's not a lot of places to practice that in the first place. But then, as I said, people get into messes because they don't speak up, or they do speak up too forcefully and so on, because they don't hold that boundary clean.
Yeah.
Another way, and that's I kind of just also repeat actually, but I do want to say it again because it's that important to me that I'm willing to risk repeating myself. Um, these nuts and bolts and processes matter. So if people start cutting corners because they think they're also enlightened,
Mhm.
that is all, like, oh, we don't need rounds. We listen to each other. Like, really?
Mhm.
Really? Like, I would not make that bold of a statement. I know my limitations very well. And at least I know them well enough that I know that that is too much of a gamble for me.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. And I find, as we're an organization, the work that Reconnects Network, that has formed quite organically and without structure in place at first. And we're growing and learning and employing more and more structure as we go, that structures that meet our values, there are still places where it's like, well, we might be a little allergic to too much organization or too many rules, or we might think, oh, that'll take up too much time. And so we have some habits that still are like, okay, yeah, these are places where a little bit more structure and more clarity can help us move along, to being more equitable, to being more co-liberatory, to being more in alignment with our values. And the rounds is great because we do organically talk about things in a way that is not always super structured. And there are some of us that don't have their voices heard as much as others because, of that organic nature of just like, it's hard to get a word in. So rounds can be extremely helpful for that. So great. Well, I want to talk just for a few minutes actually about how the work that Reconnects Network uses sociocracy, and then we're going to move into question and answer time. So anybody who's got questions brewing, you'll have a moment here. So yeah, we have, like I was mentioning, we formed really organically as a small group of volunteers. Before I came onto the team, it was 2015, where a small group of volunteers wanted to really provide an opportunity for work that reconnects facilitators around the world to find each other and to share their work. So it was just simply, there was a need and they were meeting that need. And then as the interest has grown and as the work has grown, there's been more and more need for more organization and more focus and more structure. And because the original group was a group of nice people, and they really did want everybody to be equally heard and the voices to be heard. It has evolved into this like worker self-directed, sociocratically organized circle of circles, and it's quite interesting. And we're in the growing process where some things are really crystal clear and they work really well, and other things kind of work well but they're not crystal clear, and other things are like, oh, that's not working as well as it should and it needs to become more clear. And we're doing that work, we're learning and we're growing as we go. So the thing for us is that we value connection so much. I mean, that is the whole purpose of our work, is connecting with ourselves, each other, and the earth. And so relationships are the driving force. And that's why we came into sociocracy. It's all about relationships and connection, and this egalitarian way of being together. So I will just share, actually, I want to just share this simple image that shows the way sociocracy is looking these days in the work that Reconnects Network. Here it is. So we have this lovely flower shape that has evolved, where we have the Weavers team is our central circle. And this is the group of people who are kind of paying attention to the big picture, like Ted was talking about, like who decides what and where does everything fit. And each weaver is on at least one committee, and the committees are the petals. And we have some of our weavers are staff members and some are volunteer weavers. So we always have one staff member and one staff weaver and one volunteer weaver on each committee. So then we have those different perspectives, those different angles that we're listening and learning about things from, that we can go back and forth between the circle, the committee, and the central circle, the weavers team. So I just wanted to share that because it's kind of fun to see it visually and to see how that can kind of work with not everybody needs to do everything, which is where we were for a while. Everybody was doing everything. We all had all the hats on. And then as we got more complex, it was like, well, we can't all do everything. So some of us are going to be really focused on communications, and others are going to be more focused on finances, and others are going to focus just strictly on the Deep Times Journal and getting that issue out twice a year. And others are going to focus on this webinar and conversation cafe program that we have example of right here. So yeah, just kind of a fun way of seeing how this actually is being applied within this very organization. So great. I'd love to just, oh, well, actually, Ted, anything you want to say before we open it up to questions?
Well, that was sweet. No, nothing necessarily, no.
Okay.
I will put into the chat our organizational structure also, since we're doing organizational structure sharing, why not?
Great. Yeah, great. Because we're talking in these, these kind of abstract terms, and having something visual, I think, can be really helpful sometimes, just to like see, oh, okay, well, how do these things connect? Great. So if you have a question, if you're here with us and you have a question, you can raise your hand. You can go down to the bottom menu, and I think it's in reactions. Is that where you do it? Well, Sharon has just done it. She can tell us where did you find it?
Well, first of all, this has just been amazing. Thank you. I have been struggling for some time to describe what I finally ended up calling the magic sauce for an organization that I was working with that works in very different ways. And so you have given me language and validation and just so much more. Thank you. I'll pass this. I think we get to share the recording, do we, Joe?
Sure.
Oh,
Yep.
okay. Because I think, rather than me trying to describe everything you've said, it will be helpful for them to have this available for their team to work through.
Absolutely.
But my question, along the way somewhere, you talked about, Ted, you talked about people needing to do their inner work. And if you did talk about that more, my ears must have been off or something. Could you expand a bit more on that, on how you support people to even know that's an issue, or know that's a possibility or a requirement for all of us, to keep working through that? Part of the ability to do the kinds of things that you're talking about is supported by that inner work, but in an organizational setting, that you don't kind of drift into therapy kinds of inappropriate, or what I think of as inappropriate anyway. So if you could talk some more about that, that would be lovely.
Yeah. The first thing I want to say is that I'm not looking for perfection, right? It's not that people have to, be fully whatever enlightened human beings before they can work with others. So there's this word enough that is just coming up a lot for me in sociocracy, right? What is good enough? What is clear enough? Because nothing, like Joey just said, not everything is clear and it still works. Fine, don't touch it, right? And like, if it's clear enough to operate, then it's clear enough. If a person is in good enough shape to operate, great, that's good enough. I'm not talking about perfect people. Oh my God, let's not assume that. But yeah, and actually the reason I didn't talk so much about it is because in a way, I don't know if that's odd. Let me think for a moment if that's odd. In a way, I don't see it kind of as my job. I'm kind of saying like, okay, other people are working on this piece, like all the therapy modalities and coaching and this and that personal work, including work that we connect, all of the things that are kind of looking at how an individual relates to everything around them. And then I kind of want to pick up from there and say, okay, great. And let's look at how we can turn a bunch of individuals into a team and into an organization that works together. So I kind of stay out of it a little bit. But so I guess just from just from where I'm looking, right, I need people to, as I said, hold that boundary between themselves and the circle, and to be able to willingly, maybe even enthusiastically willingly, submit themselves to a system like rounds, that helps them show up in a way. I think the one other thing that is an ingredient that we haven't talked about at all is feedback.
Mhm.
There's a lot of feedback in a system like Sociocracy and in other systems, right? So for example, at the end of every meeting, there's one round where everybody shares like, how was today? You know, what would help you do things better?
Mhm.
And of course, that's again just a stage, right? It's a stage where people can decide to get up and say something or they don't. So there's that uncertainty still in it. But ultimately, I think it's kind of hold on, let me think for a moment how I can say this. In my personal experience, because I came to this, I don't know, just through like, mainstream stuff myself. I learned about nonviolent communication first, actually, and then about sociocracy, which was probably a good order. But it kind of wore me down, because I had all the wanting to deflect responsibility piece. Like, I had, oh my God, all of the behaviors. But how many times can you be asked kind of to, how many times can you be called to the carpet until you're like, okay, fine, I'll show up, fine, I'll just, yeah, okay, got it, So, um, so I think my hope is that also the structure, including feedback rounds, blah, 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 all of the things that we talk about, they do help people get there. And I think extra work is needed, which is, I'm just going to draw a boundary there, which is not my job. Other people are doing that very nicely.
Mhm. Great. Beautiful. I love that you brought in feedback. That is another structural component that is really important and something that we're really working on with the Work That Reconnects Network team right now, is figuring out what are our systems for feedback. And we have some very kind of minimal ones, but we're trying to make that more robust because I think, Sharon, that is actually a really good way to see ourselves in the context of the group and where do we need to continue growing and stretching, and then as the quality of the process of the group rises, people either like really lean in and feel stretched by it, or they're like, I can't do this, maybe it's not, maybe more inner work is necessary to be able to lean in fully.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful, thank you.
Susan, maybe?
Mm-hmm. Yep, let's go to Susan.
Thank you all. This has been a very enriching conversation. I've spent 30 years doing different forms of dialogue and deliberation, and I guess I'll use the word governance with communities. My question has to do with the part where you talked about the shapes of the relationships. I really perked up when you started talking about fractals and mycelial stuff, kind of the organic nature of this. And I really like that you pointed out that it's voluntary. And sometimes I think people, when they hear the word governance, they're still in sort of the legal, you will be drafted into this. And I guess the way I'll focus my question is the work that I've been privileged to do with a wide array of community members is when we consciously balance not just the decision making, but how are we doing the work between the decisions? And so being very conscious about the shape of those relationships in between the decisions. And I kind of heard it indirectly referred to as, for instance, as you talked about that community. So I'm just wondering what you can share about, there's decision time, but what makes it work is it's equally important what's happening in between decisions, at least in my experience.
Yeah, nice. Just give me 1 second, just so that I have both pieces and I will forget the second one, and I already did. Okay, so I hope I'll come back. But the first thing I want to say is that so basically what we're trying to do is the way, okay, in my words, okay, the way it looks like in my brain, what we're trying to do with all the circles and linking and policies and decision-making, all of that is we're basically trying to build kind of the scaffolding so everybody knows what they're empowered to do, and then people just go do stuff, right? And that's different sometimes from what people expect. I mean, that's not what you said. I'm not in response to you, Susan, but actually what, kind of people out there think, oh, we have a meeting, so we do something. But it's actually the opposite. We're doing stuff, and now we're having a meeting to make sure it's more aligned, right? But you shouldn't be doing stuff because of a meeting. The meeting should actually, quite the opposite, constrain and kind of provide more clarity for the thing that you're already doing. So really, in a way, governance for me is kind of a whole, I don't know, a system, I guess, to provide that clarity so that people know exactly what they're empowered to do and how they all connect. That kind of flips everything on its head for how people often think about it. And I enjoy that. So that's sweet. And now what was the second thing? Because it was important. But maybe you want to say something, like both of you, either of you?
The second part was, maybe you spoke to it, it's the what's happening outside of the meeting, and how that builds the muscles of collaboration and co-liberation as much as what's happening in the meeting room.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's, I guess, one thing to highlight, maybe there's just information flow, right? Because information ideally also follows those things, right? If you did something, who needs to know about that? What do you need to kind of carry on to other people so that because information holds so much power as well, who knows what? And yeah, so information flow is almost its own topic. I find like that's there's so much there to look at as well. I don't know. What does Joe want to say? You want to say something?
I actually do, because that's such a huge piece in our work. We are a fully remote team. We have been since the very beginning, so it's not a pandemic thing. We're a global team. We work across distance and we do everything online. So it's different than, if we were in the garden together. It's all information flow. It's all, where did I put that information and who can see it and how can they contribute to it. So, we do use a lot of tools online we have a shared online work platform where everything's very transparent, and we have systems that we've agreed on about how do we post things and why and who do we tag, and so that we're not overwhelmed, right? Because not everybody needs to know everything. Only some people need to know certain things that they're directly connected to. And then also, like, whenever we're developing anything, it's always in draft form while it's in process, and we have that understanding, and we do everything very collaboratively. So like if we're forming some new language, it's in a Google Doc. People are throwing their comments in there. We're asking questions. So it's like that consent style functionality is happening all the time in that tangible work that we're doing.
We have 3 raised hands.
Right.
And we have 2 questions that were posed, I think, in the chat. So how should I go to raised hand?
Yeah. Actually, let's address this one from the chat from Anne first, and then we'll go back to a raised hand. So I don't know if you saw that there, Ted, but this question is from Anne, and it says, I'm wondering how much the level of voluntary participation is needed to get to such a structure, and how different levels of economic power have an impact on the capacity of people to really contribute to this power with way of governing. And it's coming from NVC Africa, which is an online Anglophone network. And a lot of people are struggling with access to the internet and other things like that. So I think this is a great question. You want to take this?
Yeah. Yes, acknowledging there's such a thing as coordination cost, right? That requires resources. I almost am tempted to ask a question back of like, well, what's the alternative? What's the alternative? The alternative is we just put somebody in place who then tells everybody what to do, then we don't have to talk as much, right? Or we do stuff alone. I mean, there aren't as many choices out there, sadly. So I guess, and that's slightly connecting actually to the previous question. I talked about meetings, that's part of the coordination cost, right? having to have meetings as only kind of the guidance for work that we do anyway. So in a way, sociocracy kind of builds for me on everything is allowed until it's not. So you can also have a rather loose kind of hands-off situation. That's a gamble in terms of the power over, power under stuff, right? Because I said the less structure you have, the more these things boil, like kind of come to the surface. But one can kind of tune in or dial up and dial down the level of governance that one uses. One can also just let people do stuff. Again, I think one has to kind of monitor how much is absolutely necessary for the thing that we want to do, and I don't think there are great alternatives, honestly. So let's see. Let me just see if there's anything else helpful besides, yeah, that's I see your issue. And there's no magic solution, I think, that I know of.
Yeah, and without knowing the details of that organization, I would say more in general, we can slow down, hopefully we can slow down to meet the needs and directly address the needs of whatever group we're actually working with, and adapt our ways of communication and decision making to specifically meet that group. So if internet access is not available for lengthy Zoom meetings on a regular basis, is there another way to communicate? Is there another way for those voices to come into the flow, and to be respectful and mindful of the fact that we don't want to limit access based on economic wealth or access to internet. We want to, and we're always working on that with the network too, because we function primarily in English, but we know that we are addressing a global audience, and there are a lot of people who are interested in the work that Reconnects that do not speak English, or do not, don't have great access to English. And so there are regional networks and regional hubs and kind of self-organized groups in Japanese and in German and in Spanish and in Portuguese. And so how can we uplift them and support them? Because they're meeting that need, from the ground up in those places. And then also, how can we improve our interpretation availability, and, just kind of experimenting with what are the tools available and how can they meet the needs. Yeah.
Shelley?
Great.
Hi, thanks. I'm interested in learning about transitioning groups from Robert's rules or whatever these formal structures are. So I have kind of an opposite of your remote interrelationship, where I'm in rural Michigan. It's a very conservative, and local groups are just, they're old, established, their rules, their structures, their thinking, but there's like new people coming in, and it's a lot of old people that are needing to pass the torch but don't know how to, and so the working in that, and I have been doing lots of inner work to go to these places, resource to be a safe like person to help with this transition. But then I have this like hospicing modernity thing question of, do I just let these die off and they're just a mess, and we start something new? And we have started a stewarding group, and out of these practices I didn't know about Sociocracy, sorry, I'm not gonna try to say it, but self-organizing is what it's doing, and very mycelial and slow growth, and potent, and it's lovely to work there. And so I guess it's a question of, what do I let die? And this is a personal question, of course, but maybe hearing how you all walk through, like, what do I let die? What do I go in and bring some resource and disruption and growth engagement to? Thanks.
Do I start? Yeah, I'm actually, it's such an interesting question that you ask about, should I, what do I just let die? Because first of all, what I love about that is that it acknowledges that some things are just kind of not salvageable, like it's just too ingrained. Maybe it would in theory be possible to transform the organization, but is it worth it, right? Like how much can you salvage? Because in a way, yeah, I guess sometimes people look at sociocracy as kind of the magic solution, right? And that too. And are just like, oh, we can just introduce that and all of that will go away. And like, no, maybe, maybe not. Maybe it's simply not ready and won't ever be. And we just, as you say, let it die. So I love that that is in the picture. I think there are two things one can do. Well, actually, it's one big thing. What basically offer and poke a little and see if it catches. You know, like you can start with a person, you can start within a unit, just kind of probing the system and see what it does. How much resistance is there? Because there's one thing that you said that made me curious, and that is you said people needing to pass the torch but don't know how. And remember, that's exactly like what I talked about the CEO earlier. That was like, well, somebody's got to do it because they might just be stuck in power over because nobody's there to say, oh, actually, we're here. You can distribute to us power in the following way. And then here's how you will know that it's going to get done. You know, so as I said, we're all stuck in these systems. We're all stuck, and there's only so much one person can do. So, but the question is there willingness to consider governance at all? That to me is always the litmus test. So that's why there's poking and kind of probing and seeing, are people willing to see governance as a thing, or do they think it's so-and-so's fault and so-and-so's stupid? And, you know, like, do they kind of attach it to personalities? Because then they're not going to see the systemic nature of it. And then I think it is a lost cause, honestly. Then I don't know that, at least I don't have any magic solution then, because what would be that?
Yeah, absolutely. Shall we call on Diane?
Thank you. So I don't know if you could see me. I hope so. I thank you, first of all. This has been incredible. I've taken so many notes this morning. And Ted, I just wanted, you spoke actually to graduate students at in the creative leadership program that I run in Minneapolis at MCAD. And they throughout the year continued to go back to consent decision making as one of the most important sort of concepts, practices that they encountered in the program. And so I just want to thank you for that. It's proven to be incredibly valuable to us on this journey. My question, in a sense, builds on Shelley's, also hospicing modernity, Vanessa Andreotti, the structures that need to change. As I've been listening to you today, it seems as though we're primarily referring to governance within an actual, like, people rolling up their sleeves and doing the work context. And I'm curious how this, to the extent to which it also maps to these sort of nonprofit governance structures, these legal structures, which many would argue need to be reformed for, because they do, you know, the opposite of sociocracy for all, you know, there's quite often. And if so, if you have a model of doing that or an approach to doing that already. Thank you.
Yeah, so we're a nonprofit ourselves, by the way, so that shows you it's possible. And lawyers have looked at it. We actually have like a little task force, you know, kind of a helping circle that is looking at sociocracy and legal, that connection. So, and nonprofits and co-ops are kind of the biggest things that we look at there. So let me just kind of describe how I understand the issue, and then I want to check in with you if that's kind of where you're going, also for people who might not be as deep into that. So yeah, typically, so nonprofits are handed this fiduciary responsibility, right? And the legal responsibility. And then people freak out because they're like, how can I just let, you know, social media circle do whatever they want when I am responsible? Right? And then they're really scared. And I get that because we're in a system where that is scary, right? When we're kind of dancing this dance, right, between a new kind of more trust-based system, but we are factually in a system within a system where that is not the case, and legal things then are scary. And so there's kind of a question of how much do you centralize and kind of keep things in the board, and how much do you just let go? I see a nod. Is that what you want to look at?
I think it's that, and also, I guess perhaps this might be a US context in particular, but the ways in which capacity to give money gets, it becomes a determining factor of who gets on boards, and then they're inherently not representative of the community interest or mission that the organization is trying to implement. And so, as I was trying to imagine, how would you take a SOFA approach to governance at that level? It seemed you'd have to change the people who are in the on the boards in the first place. And so I thought, is there a way to make these governing boards that are not representative and that hold a lot of power to shift them in this direction of what you're doing? I think more generally inside in self-governance within organizations, let's say.
So there are two interfaces that I want to talk to. One is kind of the board to operations. That's kind of where I jumped off, and then I will go back to what you just said. So the board to operations part, interestingly, I guess I sometimes remind people of, well, even in a super centralistic kind of centralized whatever board, you don't control everything, right? There's still like, so it's not like if people tell me, but I'm responsible, and you're like, yeah, but that's already not true, like, I mean, yes, you're responsible, fiduciary, blah, 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 all of that, but it's not true that you double check everything anybody in operations does. So it's just a gradual difference for me, right? So that takes away kind of that black and white thinking between decentralizing things means we're going to be in trouble. That's not true, right? Because otherwise it would already be the case. So there's that, and kind of just having more of a process by which we can add more clarity on how we delegate and what that means and so on is helpful there. And by the way, from the legal perspective, from what I hear from lawyers who work in those fields, they say, all we want is clarity. We just want to know that it is somehow clear. Because all of those, like the legalese for that is, this and this and that needs to happen unless otherwise specified. So then go specify it otherwise, right? You can do that. But people are often too scared to do that. And so they say, oh no, this is how it's done. People on the board can't be paid, blah, blah, all of those rules that are just not set in stone as much as people think. Then, of course, it's a capacity issue, right? How much time do you have to educate yourself on what other ways of doing are? The second piece is, kind of who sits on the board. I guess there's a lot to say about that. I'm just going to touch on kind of a few things. One is, I guess, who decides who's on a board. That's an interesting one. There's different models, right? I personally would absolutely separate kind of fundraising and board work, because it's a very different thing. To me, it's ridiculous that they even meshed like this, and it's weird. Anyway, but one really beautiful vision, just for people to kind of connect with, is that the person who put Sociocracy together, Jared Edinburgh, for him, we were talking about interconnectedness and interdependence, which I know is a big topic for people here as well. So what they're doing is basically taking that one level up and say, boards should also have outside people that are somehow connected to the field, kind of to the wider field. Like, for example, we had a direct competitor on our board, like on our mission circle, what we call it, because that was so interesting. It was just so interesting to, and he was willing. It was just such a gift because he truly understood what we were doing, and I'm on the board of actually competitors. That's also super fun. So just a whole idea, that there are neighboring organizations that then can be connected and really have that web of organizations. That's really cool. But other than that, I think it's going to deep into kind of who is on the board and who decides that, because there's so many different models. So if it's okay with you, we would either put it separate or I don't know. What do you want to do, Diane?
Incredibly helpful. Thank you. All of that really greatly appreciated.
Awesome. I would also love to add into that for you, Diane, that the Sustainable Economies Law Center is an incredible resource, and they have a lot of materials for worker self-directed nonprofits and alternative ways of working with The structure's right within the legal requirements in the United States. We just, a team of a subset of the Work That Reconnects Network team just participated in a year-long program that they put together called Collaborate to Co-liberate. And it was incredible, in-depth, very detailed, through all of the different parts of running a nonprofit. And we were in that program with, not sure how many other nonprofits, 20 to 50 other nonprofits were also participating. So I got to go in breakout rooms and talk to people who were more in that position of transitioning from a power over structure and like a, specifically conventional nonprofit structure into a more co-liberatory structure. Whereas ours, kind of emerged in this other way. So I got to hear some of those challenges and see that there are really ways of responding and adapting.
Adrian and Petra had some questions over in the chat.
Great.
Adrian, would you like me to read it? Adrian asks, is there a general language for practicing sociocracy worldwide, or are there more dialects used in different and at the same time? Or sort of variations on the theme, I guess Adrian is wondering about.
Yeah, there are variations. There are, it's really, I mean, yeah, using the word dialect, which I think is appropriate because they're kind of related languages, like, I don't know, German and Dutch. I don't know if that gives you a reference point, or Portuguese and Spanish, that are kind of, you can almost understand each other, but maybe not quite. And even closer than that. So for example, holacracy is kind of still maybe more like two languages, but very closely related. Holacracy, sociocracy. Then there are a lot of dialects within sociocracy. Sociocracy 3.0, kind of our way, what a kind of more trying to be big tent. But then really every organization has its own dialect, really, right? They will have like for example, if you look at, I saw somebody here from XR, like, for example, Extinction Rebellion might have the pattern that basically, using a version of sociocracy, though they don't call it that. Like there's always kind of a reading, right? And like, so the meeting structure is not kind of the standard meeting structure, but there's an additional part in it because that's the dialect that is spoken there. And I think that's fantastic, right? And, like making it your own. So those are the different, those are the different ways. I guess what I want to do though is, and that's again, that's kind of where I'm coming from, is I want there enough literacy overall around governance and enough clarity so that if I walk into a different organization, they don't just, it's not, I still kind of recognize similar things, and they might call this and this that, and that's great, but kind of just so that we understand each other, or that we have maybe even some sort of meta language to talk about these things in a better way. So somebody can sit me down in my onboarding and say, okay, here's how we call this is what we call that, and here's how this works. But generally that's the pattern, and then I get it. That would just be endlessly useful if we didn't all have to reinvent and relearn everything all the time. So I guess it's really, to me, literacy is really a good word for me here, because there are only so many ways of doing things. So it really feels like, yeah, there's, and that's, I guess, maybe where my linguist background comes from. All languages kind of have a common core, a universality about it. And what is that for governance? And could we please learn it so that we can make it easier to understand each other and to kick off and launch new projects and so on.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks. Eileen, did you say there was another one in the chat we want to bring in?
Yeah, so Petra, who I think was mentioned that she's part of an XR local group. She was also wondering about potential use of this in her work and the work in academia, which is so highly hierarchical and competitive. Just curious to know if there were any ideas about that.
Academia really sucks because in so many different ways. I mean, I know of a bunch of projects and even departments, small departments, that are looking at sociocracy, already using part of it. That is a question that keeps coming up. Often what happens is that they start kind of in the cross-cutting, like for example in a DEI kind of effort where, but then the problem about that is, so let's say you have, whatever, a group of 5 students, 5 professors, and 5 kind of other faculty administration, right, working together on a topic, then I know they sometimes adopt sociocracy, which is great. And it doesn't take away the power imbalance between the students and the professors, because that is real, and the real, as real as it is.
Mhm.
So I'm feeling very torn about it, because I think it's good as a system for that, and it also has to work around those power imbalances, and power differentials are really hard to work around, also for a system like sociocracy. So I think one has to carve out spaces, right, and say, no, in this case, like, for example, if professors and students could make a deal that whatever happens here stays here, that would, for example, be kind of carving out space and say, no, but this is this is a peer space, and we're doing this together. How realistic that is, given the ingrained culture and so on in academia, I'm not sure. Might depend. But yeah, other than that, I know as I said, small units are looking at it. But it's really daunting, because it changes. I mean, yeah, it changes so much. And in academia in particular, but also in other spaces, right? If you rely on making progress up the ladder, what's your incentive? Like, so that's for me, I don't know if I said that. Yeah, I think I said that. Kind of, if organizations are here, right, there's the personal stuff, which we talked about, but then the legal and, for example, the, hierarchies and kind of status and economics and all of that, the societal systems that are holding us in place, they still exist. So there's only so much working around of that, as on that side. So academia is, I don't know. Sometimes I wonder if that is one of the systems that will just have to die. We have to rebuild it, because I don't know, academia seems so hard to deal with.
Mhm.
I was wondering, because we don't even have we don't even have common goals. There's not even that.
Yeah.
So
Really
should we start with that? Like, is that the initial problem already? I'm not sure.
I think the initial problem is that all of academia beyond your department is set up in a competitive way. So you can only make deals with each other that you're going to ignore that and play well with each other. But it's all like it's the same. I don't know if that's maybe too big of a jump, but in my mind, that's exactly like also ownership. For example, if I own the company, I can tell you as often as I want to that we're equals, but we're not, And the same with professor and status and all of that. We are not. So I guess my question then for experiments in academia and in all places of power differential is, how willing are you to take the gamble of creating an egalitarian space? And how much do I believe that everybody is really in on that? Or is it going to bite me in the butt, and I'm going to actually then be on the losing end of it if it does fall apart? But maybe, I don't know, maybe maybe I'm totally wrong, and something will emerge that will just make it more beautiful and more doable. And then it will become something that people feel drawn to. I don't know.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And Diane is saying, yes, hospice,
Yeah.
rebirth.
Sophie was asking any experience of introducing sociocracy practices and ideas into government. And I just want to give a shout out to Neil for sharing a host of resources that are related and helpful. So thank you, Neil.
Yeah, Ted, do you ever work with people in government?
I have in Canada, but again, it tends to be those cross-cutting things, like, wait, hold on, what is that called? I don't know, like kind of what would you call that? Like collaboratives that are kind of working with government and other organizations. It's in those cross-collaborative spaces often that then sociocracy, for example, is used. So not in like government, but government adjacent, I guess.
Right. Because in national governments, or in, in these governments, the structure is set up in a very hierarchical and very specific way. So just like you're talking about with academia. So it's like you can't necessarily apply sociocracy on top of that because you have that structure so firmly in place, being reinforced all the time. However, I will say on a very, very small scale, I have experienced sociocratic values being able to play out on local government levels. And this is what I was talking about at the beginning of the webinar. I was on a council. I've been on councils where Robert's rules were in place and the structure was technically very business as usual, but the people had shared values and had a culture of listening to everybody before a decision was being made, so that even though we technically were voting, it really was always like just checking for consent, basically, is, is what it was. So, you know, depending on the group of people that you're working with, you can bring some of these values in and some of these practices in and kind of infuse, whether it's in your department in academia or in your own working groups in government.
Great. I think we're at 12:50. Joe, I don't know whether there's time to share upcoming events or.
Yeah, let's see. Ted, you have some final
Progress.
words for this conversation, and then we're gonna just turn it over to you for sharing any upcoming SOFA stuff.
I'm so full of all the different things right now too. So, and do I have final words? There's something I want to say that I wasn't planning on saying. So regular resources, you know, like, so no, hold on. Let me go back to one thing. So earlier somebody asked kind of how to kind of, you know, where I said to probe the system, and I realized I didn't say what one can actually do to probe, right? And that goes back to what we said in the beginning. So that's kind of these now what, you know, here. So the now what is suggest rounds. Just do it, you know. And you don't have to say, oh, there's this thing called sociocracy and there are rounds and this and that. Just say, hey, how about we try to each be one by one without interrupting each other, and we just see where people are at, you know, and see if maybe they fall in love with it, and maybe, you know, and also not sweating if somebody breaks rounds here and there, fine, you know, just kind of to just gently shift into that being the expectation. Typically people don't jump with 2 feet, but like right into it. Then educating yourself about consent and how that works, and kind of just keeping in mind structural clarity on all the domains, decision-making domains, claimed and kind of held in a healthy way, right? Like maybe in your organization, there's an area where everybody is always complaining that nobody's doing it, but it's actually not clear. So just bringing that lens of governance clarity and kind of, do we have enough in place so that we can hold it co-responsibly? That is something one can do. So suggesting those things and then seeing what happens. The thing that I was considering now actually putting in the chat, because we talked so much about it indirectly, which is my fault, is because I'm about to launch a book, which means I spent the last months in this headspace. And of course, it shows in the things that I say. So if you're curious about kind of what I talked about in terms of individuals, groups, organizations, and all the emergent structures and kind of what's important for power with along the way, then this is the book that you will want to look at, because it's full of that. And then I think we have the general kind of link on resources that Sociocracy for All has. Just basically our resource page has a video also, and that's also a page that you can share, right? If you want to say like, hey, maybe there's something here, a little appealing video that people can look at, and then all the things they can read about. So it's a great starting point to get lost in rabbit holes, if that's what you want to do. Anything else? I think I'm complete. And the start here page, yes. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and Neil has put a bunch of links in the chat as we're going. I imagine you work with Neil in Sociocracy for All. This has been so wonderful, and we've got some great feedback in the chat. And so I just encourage you to kind of like take a moment if you didn't get a chance while we were talking to check it out before you log off, because there's some gratitude in there for you, Ted. And it's been really wonderful to talk with you. Really great to explore this. And I want to just, oh, actually, I have to do a specific thing here at the end. I want to thank everybody for being here. It's been great to see that there's people who actually care about governance and who are willing to hang out and listen and explore for 2 whole hours about governance. And I think the big takeaway for me from this is to make governance real, to bring it into focus, to value it, to value that it's the way that we relate to each other. It's the way that we function as groups of humans. So thank you, Ted, for really articulating that so well, and kind of letting us know it's important and worthwhile to pause and pay attention to it and get good at it and develop those skills, because that is really how we take it into our own hands. Excellent. So I want to just invite everybody, if you're not already connected in with the Work That Reconnects network in some way, please visit our website. I just popped a link in the chat there. And we also have a very exciting 5-day event coming up called the Gaian Gathering. And it will actually be 40 hours of diverse, wonderful, engaging content. It's been this beautiful collaborative experience to pull this together. We've got keynote speakers on all of these incredible topics. We're going to be moving through the spiral of the Work That Reconnects, from gratitude to honoring our pain to seeing with new and ancient eyes, deep time, and going forth. And we are going to also have Work That Reconnects practices and some skill building spaces, art, music, and some wonderful sessions of gratitude for Joanna Macy. And she's going to be present with us so that we can share some gratitude with her. So I really highly encourage you to stay tuned for that. So make sure that you're subscribed to our newsletter list and following our Facebook and Instagram if you want to be tuned into all of the announcements for that. Thank you all so much for being here, and thank you, Ted. It's been a pleasure to spend this time with you.
It was very enjoyable. Thank you, everybody.
Great.
Thank you, Ted. Thanks to everybody.
To learn more about the Work That Reconnects networks, webinars, and Conversation Cafe program, please visit our website at workthatreconnects.org. We welcome you to become a community member of the Work That Reconnects network. Visit workthatreconnects.org, community member registration, for more information.